The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure.
Those are the words of Thomas Jefferson, our third president, and the main subject of this, the third episode of the Dead Presidents podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Dead Presidents podcast. I am here with my good friend James J. Hamilton.
And I'm here with my friend Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
Hello to you all and welcome back for another exciting episode of the Dead Presidents podcast. You're going to learn, you're going to laugh, you're going to love it.
You're going to learn about our third president, Thomas Jefferson. He's the main subject of the third episode. We've got George Washington and John Adams under our belts. You're already experts in their lives and careers. It's time to add
You're
Thomas
one step
Jefferson
closer to that Ivy League college of your choice.
You're going to have a PhD when this is up.
Yes.
That's our promise to you.
And we're also going to promise to keep it fun.
We are going to have fun because before we get into Thomas Jefferson, we're going to do this week's top 5 list.
It's the top 5 Presidential Cradle-Robbers. Number 5.
James Madison. Now, a lot of presidents have spent time in the arms of women who are substantially younger than them. And that's what today's top 5 list is all about.
And we talked a little bit about it in the last episode.
We've got James Madison coming up here at number 5. He was 17 years older than his first lady, Dolly Madison. When they met and got married, he was 43 years old. She was only 26.
And she was a nice find.
Oh, yeah. Madison had not had a lot of luck before then. He had a previous engagement to Kitty Floyd, who was 16 years younger than him. But this occurred when he was 31 years old and she was only 15.
Wow.
They were engaged to be married, but she broke it off. She married someone else, someone more age-appropriate, and Madison was devastated. And by the year 1794... he was getting up there in age. It looked like he might be doomed to lifelong bachelorhood.
Wow. What's he going to do?
When
he's got to find a wingman.
Yep. He turns to his friend Aaron Burr, and he asks Aaron Burr to introduce him to a young widow whose legal affairs Burr was handling.
Well, that's nice. Yeah, stick around to that Aaron Burr fella. I'm sure that's going to work out good for you later.
Aaron Burr, he definitely knows his way around the ladies. Madison chose a good wingman.
Yeah.
And he got hooked up with a very eligible bachelorette.
Dolly Payne Todd, a recently widowed. Yellow fever carried off her husband and her newborn, and that just left her with a 2-year-old son. So, Madison slides on up to her. And they hit it off.
Yeah.
And during their courtship, Madison's friend told Dolly, he thinks so much of you in the day that he has lost his tongue. At night he dreams of you, and starts in his sleep, calling on you to relieve his flame, for he burns to such an excess that he will be shortly consumed. So we're talking about,
Dolly was hot stuff.
I don't know. To me, that description conjures up, Madison's friends writing to Dolly and saying, look, I've walked in on him. He has, huge erections, and he's, busting his nut in his sleep and crying out and shit, and do something about it, my God.
He's been waiting 43 years. He needs some relief.
Yeah.
And Dolly was a very, very eligible widow. She attracted a lot of attention. She has been described as radiant and full-bosomed.
Buxom.
Washington Irving called her a fine, buxom dame.
Oh, yeah, there you
One woman wrote that Dolly had the most beautiful neck and bosom I ever saw. She was fond, was Dolly, of low-cut, revealing French fashions, a style that Abigail Adams called, quote, an outrage upon all decency.
Well,
I wouldn't mind catching a glimpse of young 26-year-old Dolly wearing an outfit that was an outrage upon all decency.
yeah. And she was a hell of a lady, too, and it'll be good to talk about her in episode 4
Yeah,
of
she
our
became a
podcast.
very important political partner of Madison, as we will get to on our next episode. But for now, Madison doing a little cradle robbing, but that's nothing compared to what we've got coming up.
Top 5 Presidential Cradle-Robbers. Number 4.
Benjamin Harrison.
Harrison was actually just a year younger than First Lady Caroline Harrison. But during his presidency, she died of tuberculosis.
That old TB.
What's a poor widower to do? Well, turns out the late Mrs. Harrison had a niece who lived in the White House as her assistant, Mary Dimmock. Apparently, trouble started while the First Lady was still alive, as Mary began to exercise an influence over the president which interfered with the domestic peace of the family, and he permitted and encouraged that influence. The First Lady suffered what she considered were indignities, and the president insisted that she was being foolishly and causelessly jealous. Mrs. Harrison discussed with a friend how to get rid of her niece. Mary was given to understand that her continued residence in the White House was unwelcome to Mrs. Harrison, but she appealed to the president, and he refused to consent to her departure.
Trouble in paradise.
Harrison and Mary parted ways after Mrs. Harrison's death, but then got together a couple years later after he left office. He was 25 years older than her. He was 62, and she was 37 when they married. His 2 children, who were older than the bride, refused to attend the wedding. They strongly objected to the marriage and expressed unconcealed disapproval for what they considered an act disrespectful to the memory of their mother. I mean, come on. She's literally, I think she's about the same age of his oldest kid.
Yeah, not even that old. Their mother tried to get this woman kicked out of the White House.
Yeah.
Harrison wouldn't let it happen, and then right after her death, that's where he turns to for his companionship.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact age, but yeah, I think that the oldest kids were about the same age, and they were like, what the fuck?
Mm-hmm.
So, a few months before the wedding, the kids were still hoping that it was going to be broken off. A newspaper said of the new wife, "She is not a beautiful woman, but she is charming. Her features are good, but not regular. She does not appeal to your senses, but to your heart." In other words, she had a great personality.
Yep.
And maybe that coupled well with Benjamin Harrison, because he was known for having an icy personality.
Yep.
Opposites attract and all that. Which brings us to Top 5 Presidential Cradle-Robber.
Number 3.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump is 24 years older than the First Lady, Melania Trump. This is not a new situation for Trump to find him in. His first 2 wives were 3 and 17 years younger than him. He's used to being married to much younger women. They get younger and younger as he goes along, or rather, he gets older. They stay the same age. That's what Matthew McConaughey would say. And that's what Trump thinks. He likes to joke about it. He said recently, as you've probably read, she's slightly younger than me, just a tiny little bit. Trump, he spent, most of his adult life cultivating an image of being with much younger women. He spilled a lot of this kind of thing on Howard Stern episodes, who he appeared on many times, and Howard Stern likes to get him to talk about the nitty-gritty and get right into the dirty stuff. One time Trump told Howard Stern...
I'm going to have to do the voice.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm going to have to do the voice. You can set it up.
he'd tell Howard Stern, he'd be dating a 21-year-old and she'd be studying algebra. And he's like, that's embarrassing. That's too young. He said 30 is the perfect age. But then when she's 35, that's checkout time. Trump, he met Melania while he was getting divorced from his second wife. She was born in Slovenia, came to the United States for modeling, was very successful. She was in the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. She has posed nude. Google nude photos of your first lady. They're out there. When she met Donald, he was 52. She was 28. They got married when he was 58 and she 34. When they first started dating in 1999, they called into the Howard Stern show. Trump said Melania was naked at the time. Howard asked, what is she wearing? She said not much. Trump said she was naked. She said they have sex every night. In 2004, they got engaged, and Trump went on Howard Stern to say,
she's terrific in bed. She wouldn't want me to say that, but she is. In the history of the world, no one has gotten more beautiful women than I have. Melania has one of the greatest bodies I've ever seen.
After their marriage, Howard Stern asked Trump if he would stay with her if she was horribly disfigured in a car accident. He said that he would, but quickly added, How
do her tits look? How are the breasts?
How are the breasts? That's very important. If they're intact, he'll stick around. But this is who he is. This is the kind of image he's cultivated. He gets a lot of flack, but as he once said, quote,
It doesn't really matter what the media writes as long as you've got a young, beautiful piece of ass and you can grab onto it. You're a star. They let you do it.
And say what you will about Donald Trump, he's always had a young, beautiful piece of ass. You got to give him that. And that's something that we're also going to have to give to number 2 in the top 5 greatest presidential cradle-robbers.
John Tyler.
John Tyler.
John Tyler was the same age as his first lady, Letitia Christian Tyler. They were married for 29 years. They had 8 children. But in 1842, she had a stroke and died in the White House. That's a fruitful marriage.
Very
and
fruitful.
Very tragic end. And they were together for a long time. It was clear that they loved one another. 8 children. My God, what a tragedy. Also in 1842, Tyler's son John Jr. fell for a bright and flirtatious young woman from New York named Julia Gardner. She and her sister had been brought by her father to fish for husbands in Washington high society. John Jr. was married and may have considered divorcing his wife.
That's the gossip we've heard.
Even though the First Lady's corpse was barely cold, President Tyler elbowed John Jr. out of the way and made it clear that he wanted Miss Gardner for himself. She was 22 years old at the time, and he was 52, 30 years older than her. His eldest daughter was 5 years older than Julia. 6 months after his wife's death, he proposed to her. She didn't say yes, but he kept after her.
He's not going to give up.
And she might be playing a little hard to get with
She is.
the president.
How's that turn out?
Right. The event that finally brought them together was an excursion aboard the warship USS Princeton. Many high-ranking officials were there. Dolly Madison was there. Julia Gardner was there, properly chaperoned by her father. During a demonstration of the ship's guns, one of the cannons exploded, and the shrapnel killed 6 people, including the Secretary of State, Abel Upshur, Secretary of the Navy, and Julia's father. She fainted.
Bloodbath.
Absolute carnage.
Carnage.
Total bloodbath on board. It was Quentin Jaws times 3.
Mm-hmm.
So she faints. She wakes up in the president's arms. Tyler's quiet strength sustained her, and in her mourning, she changed her feelings towards him. She said, "After I lost my father, I felt differently towards the president. He seemed to fill the place and to be more agreeable in every way than any younger man ever was or could be."
That's some severe daddy issues.
Sounds like, James.
Talking about the The president filling her father's place. That's not the only place he was trying to fill.
Well, that's true, as it turns out.
Mm-hmm.
A few months after the Princeton disaster, they married in a private ceremony. She was 24, he was 54. His daughters disliked her and didn't attend the wedding. Julia's mother wrote to the new First Lady, "Tone down your lovemaking. Let your husband work during all business hours. Business should take the precedence of caressing. Reserve your caressing for private leisure, and be sure to let no one see it unless you wish to be laughed at."
Did they listen to that advice?
They did not
No.
heed that advice. As a matter of fact, they cranked it up to 11.
That's right.
Tyler had 7 more children with Julia, for a total of 15. A presidential record. Unbelievable. He was 70 when his youngest child was born. Tyler was born during the George Washington administration. His youngest child died during the Truman administration, and his grandson is still alive at the moment of recording this broadcast. Actually, I believe 2 grandsons are still alive.
Yeah.
Lyon and Harrison.
Wow.
One in Texas and one in Virginia.
The Tyler line still going strong.
Very strong. What a remarkable thing. To be so little removed. They were just father and late. They had a strong seed.
They certainly did.
Something. And that'll bring us to the top 5 presidential cradle-robber.
Number 1.
Grover Cleveland.
If you thought John Tyler was rocking the cradle, what do you hear about Grover Cleveland? At the time he became president, Cleveland was a bachelor. He had never married. He was a bachelor president, but he was not a virgin president.
He wasn't James Buchanan again.
No. Cleveland came into the office with the stain of a bastard child on his record.
Boom, 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 boom.
He had spent some time with a widow of loose morals. He wasn't the only one who was spending time with her. When she became pregnant, he doubted that he was the father, but he decided to take responsibility anyway because the other options were all married men that would be much more complicated for them. So
Wow, that is taking one for the team.
He did take one for the
team.
team.
Holy shit.
So he started making informal child support payments. She was drinking heavily while nursing the infant. So he had her committed to an insane asylum and put the child in an orphanage.
Wow.
She later kidnapped the child. He gave her $500 to go away, and the child was adopted and grew up to be a doctor. Happy ending for that child.
Yeah, wow. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. So, she's a heavy drinker. She's committed to an insane asylum. The child's put in an orphanage. Does she escape the insane asylum and kidnap the child?
I think she was let out.
She was released and then immediately resorted to kidnapping.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it got her $500 to go away.
Well.
And it got
a hefty sum.
It became a campaign issue for Cleveland while he was running for president in 1884. He would be taunted over his bastard child, and crowds would chant, Ma, where's my pa?
Going to the White House, ha ha ha.
Yep, and that's where Cleveland went. He went to the White House, and it was time for him to really start robbing the cradle. Because here's the thing about Grover Cleveland. He had been a lawyer. His law partner was Oscar Folsom.
They were great friends.
They were partners. And when Grover
Lifelong
Cleveland
friends.
was 27 years old, Oscar Folsom's wife had a daughter, and Grover Cleveland met his future wife, Frances Folsom, when she was just an infant. He doted on her as a child. She grew up and called him Uncle Cleve. He knows her all throughout her childhood. When she was 11 years old, her father died without a will, and Cleveland was appointed administrator of his estate. He became the manager of the family finances. It was basically her legal guardian.
Now, there is a quote that I've read in a biography of Cleveland that is really wild. Okay, so this was when her father was still alive, and Frances was young. maybe 6 or 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And Grover Cleveland was over, and she asked him, how come you never got married? Just being a little girl, just asking a question like, how come you never got married?
Yeah.
And her father admonished her, and Cleveland said, no, it's okay. I'm just waiting for my wife to grow up.
Wow. Pretty creepy.
Yeah.
Well, because, at some point, that's the thing. At some point, Cleveland started having some thoughts, because when he became president, young Frances Folsom and her mother would visit him often, and rumors swirled that Cleveland was going to propose to the mother.
That just seemed the more logical thing to be.
All of high society wanted the bachelor president to get married. He's so eligible. Who's he going to marry? That's the speculation. How about old Mrs. Folsom, who comes by to visit with her daughter? It's probably her, right? But wait, Frances, she just graduated college. She just turned 21, and Cleveland proposed to her, not the mother, to young Frances. They called her Frank. Her nickname was Frank.
Imagine the mother's reaction, like she thinks, I'm going to be the next first lady of the United States. And then he's like, oh, how about that daughter? How about?
Well, Frankie said yes. The engagement was kept secret until just 5 days before the wedding, when the 49-year-old sitting president married a 21-year-old girl in the Blue Room of the White House. And apparently nobody was all that scandalized by it.
No, actually people loved it.
Yeah, it
was the first time there was a presidential wedding.
Yeah.
It was huge. There was illustrations, even the London Illustrated Times had illustrations of the White House wedding and covered it. It was actually received really well.
Yeah, it seems outrageous by modern standards, but at the time, everyone was just excited to have a young, beautiful first lady. She was characterized as a beauty, was known as shapely, and, quote, full-bosomed, the same appellation applied to Dolly Madison. That seems to be the most historianly way of saying.
Yeah, I suppose
somebody has a nice rack.
Yeah.
And Frank Folsom Cleveland came into office with those kind of assets, at least.
Yeah.
And she captivated the public. Everyone was excited. She was, young and having children while he was president. Everyone loved her. In fact, the New York Times wrote, quote, other presidents have shared the executive mansion with wives whose personal attractiveness, accomplishments, wit, and tact have commanded admiration. But in not one of all the wives of the presidents have the whole population manifested more interest than they do in the present lady of the White House. Her youth, beauty, grace, animation, and unaffected cordiality are irresistible.
Yeah, she was a good one, and she'll be fun to talk about in episode 22.
Yeah,
when we get to the Clevelands.
I just wonder at what moment during her life did Cleveland, he's looking at her as a little girl, and when did he start looking at her as having other kinds of potentialities?
Apparently pretty early.
Pretty early.
Yeah. Apparently.
Pretty creepily so.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
pretty wild, but I mean, it turned out good. I mean, the Baby Ruth candy bar thing came from their daughter, Ruth.
Yeah.
Not Babe Ruth, the baseball player, as many people believe.
No.
That was after.
Actually, I read that they tried to claim that it was based on Cleveland's daughter, Baby Ruth, so that they didn't have to pay Babe Ruth royalties for naming it after him.
No, well, either way, good move.
Either way, little Baby Ruth tragically did not live to adulthood, but she was a darling of the American people.
And you could think about her every Halloween.
During her young time. But that was Cleveland. He enjoyed his 21-year-old bride, as did the nation. He was the #1 presidential cradle-robber. And as we transition into the rest of the episode, we have an honorable mention. Thomas Jefferson was 30 years older than Sally Hemings. And he may have started hooking up with her when he was 46 years old and she was only 16.
My goodness.
That's something we will get into here as we continue on the Dead Presidents podcast right after a word from our sponsors.
Thanks for listening.
The Dead Presidents podcast is brought to you in part by Harvey's Anti-Venereal Pills, a certain and infallible cure for the venereal disease in every state and in the worst of cases without the use of mercury, restraint of diet, or hindrance of business when all other methods have failed and even without the knowledge of the patient's own bedfellow.
Wow, if that ain't handy, I don't know what is.
That's Harvey's Anti-Venereal Pills for when you need to treat your VD on the DL.
Excellent. Now, an important message from our sponsor, William Eddy. Whereas Rachel, my wife, being lawfully married to me, but she being previously infected with the venereal disease unbeknownst to me, and thus greatly injured my health and reputation, and has deceived me in such a manner that I am determined not to live with her any longer. This notice is therefore to forbid all persons trusting or harboring her on my account, for I will pay no debts of her contracting after this date. You heard that, listeners. Don't lend any money to Rachel Eddy expecting her husband to pay for it. What a sad state of affairs. My God, a marriage in tatters? I can't help but think this all could have been avoided if only Rachel had used Harvey's anti-venereal pills. She could have been cured, and William would have been none the wiser.
A word from our sponsor, Jacob Zeiger. Whereas my wife Elizabeth has eloped from my bed and board without any just cause or provocation, and has taken shelter with a man not becoming a white woman, I have thought proper hereby to caution all persons from trusting her or giving her any goods on my account, as I am determined from this date to pay no debts of her contracting. Oh boy, let me get this straight. Jacob Zeiger is white. His wife Elizabeth is white. But the man she's shacked up with is not white. Damn. I'm guessing this marriage is over. Once you elope black, you don't go back. Listeners, if your significant other has cheated on you with a person of a different race and you want to announce it to the whole world, you can buy an ad on our show. Hit us up on Twitter at DeadPrezPodcast. That's Prez with a Z, where you can learn more about our sponsors and see their original ads published in newspapers during Thomas Jefferson's presidency.
And now, back to the show. It's episode 3 of the Dead Presidents podcast. We are back. I am Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
And we're here to tell you all about Thomas Jefferson.
He was the third president.
And an incredibly important one. Let's begin at the beginning. His early life. 1743, Virginia. Thomas Jefferson pops forth from the womb. His parents, Peter Jefferson, a planter, surveyor, public official, militia officer, member of the House of Burgesses. Big deal.
He was. He surveyed the border of Virginia and North Carolina and drafted the definitive map of Virginia. He was rich, but not super rich, married into the prominent Randolph family. Thomas's mother was Jane Randolph. Very little is known about her. Jefferson had 6 sisters and a brother, and his father died when he was only 14, making him the man of the house.
He was I'll use the word extraordinary man of the house, because he was pretty bookish. I mean, he was tall but gawky.
Mm-hmm.
He was an intellectual. He enjoyed nature. He went to boarding school, learned the classics, Latin, Greek, French. Went to the College of William and Mary at Williamsburg. studied philosophy, science, math, and literature, then went on to study law, and was admitted to the bar in 1767.
Thomas Jefferson was a very intellectual man. His religion comes down to us as being called deist. He believes in a God, but not so much one active in our lives. He favored reason over revelation. He advocated reading the Bible with the same critical eye as other books.
This is one of the most fascinating reads. Just go to Monticello's website, I think has it. I think that's where I got it. But get the Jefferson Bible. It is a wild undertaking of an individual. He took the 4 Gospels, cut them together into one big thing, and cut out everything supernatural, and pasted it together as one story called The Morals of Jesus. And that wasn't enough. He also translated the same thing into French, Latin, and Greek. And they're all side by side, and he has little cutout things that he added with maps and stuff. It's just an unbelievable undertaking. It just absolutely wild, and a really kind of cool way to, look at the Holy Book.
Mm-hmm. And look at how Thomas Jefferson in his mind worked, being really, a Renaissance man, interested in all kinds of different branches of knowledge, science, architecture, botany, farming, animal husbandry, meteorology. He recorded the high and low temperature every day. He was interested in mechanical engineering.
He tried to rival the Adamses' library.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy was basically, he could have been genius level of intellect. I mean, really, he did all kinds of shit. I mean, there wasn't anything he didn't do. Wine connoisseur, played the fiddle, and was known to be pretty good.
I don't know if he beat the devil in any fiddling contests, but
perhaps
he was
not.
Holding his own.
From what I have looked into that a little bit. Jefferson was more violin classical playing, whereas John Tyler was more fiddle oriented. John Tyler was said to play a mean fiddle. Jefferson played probably more classical compositions in what wouldn't be considered like fiddle. It would just be violin. But he was supposed to be really fucking good at it. And, this guy had everything going for him. He's not going to have any trouble finding a wife.
No. He was, I think he was a little shy with the ladies at first, but he had enough going for him that he was able to find himself a nice young widow. Martha Wales Skelton had previously married when she was about 18 or 19 years old. Her husband and her first child died, just like we discussed with Dolly Madison earlier. It's a bit of that going around at the time.
Yeah.
And now, Martha was really important in Jefferson's life, but she died. But
she's an enigma
early.
In history, isn't she?
Yeah, not a lot is known about her. Apparently, really, none of her letters survive, and there's really not even a real portrait of her that survives.
I imagine he destroyed them.
He might have. He was really, really broken up by her death and was kind of tight-lipped about her the rest of his life because it was probably too painful of a subject to go into.
Yeah. So I think in regards, at that point, in regards to seeking female companionship, he probably was like, hell, let's just see what happens.
Yeah, we will see what happens a little bit later. But with Martha, she was pregnant 7 times. Over 10 years, only 2 of her children survived to adulthood. The pregnancies were really devastating on her health and strength, and she ended up dying in 1782 from complications of her last presidency. And as we said, Thomas, no?
You said last presidency.
Oh, sorry. Well, giving birth is the female presidency.
Yeah. Okay, that's going to be on the outtakes.
We don't condone those views here on the Dead Presidents podcast.
Okay. All right, let's go back. Where are we at? Okay, so, yeah, we'll start with she died in 1782.
Martha died in 1782 from complications of her last pregnancy. And as we said, Jefferson was devastated. He refused to leave his room for 3 weeks. He collapsed, and it was just a horrifying scene.
He was just a shell of himself for a while.
Yeah. But he, rebounded off of her death to... That opened him up kind of the first several years of the Revolution. He really felt tied to home because of his wife's death. And after she passed, he branched out more. Yeah. Well, that being said, let's dive right on into the pre-presidential career of Thomas Jefferson, beginning with the House of Burgesses, which he served in from 1769 to 74, and where he wrote the Summary View of the Rights of British America, which was pretty hugely important as it made the case against Parliament's authority over the American colonies. So, big deal. Yeah, this is where Jefferson first starts making a name for himself. He writes out this treatise arguing that Parliament has no authority whatsoever over the colonies. Like if Amazon were to have like a frequently bought together thing, it would be Common Sense and this. Yep. At the time, the theory was, well, we're under the king, but not Parliament. So all the taxes that they're passing, illegitimate. And Jefferson's writing was an important step in forming that theory, and it helped make a name for himself and helped get him sent to the Continental Congress. And as a Virginia delegate to said Continental Congress, he was appointed on the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. So we talked about it a little bit last episode. We got John Adams. We got the big man, Benny Frank. BF. And we got Thomas Jefferson. Were the big three. Yep. And they assigned Jefferson to do the writing. He'd established a track record as a writer. Yeah. I mean, he had some really great fucking shit. I mean, the dude was legitimately a writer. Mm-hmm. And Adams and, the rest of them thought that they kind of had more important things to do at the time and that the actual text of the Declaration wasn't going to be a big deal. But Jefferson sat down to write, and his writing kind of turned it into a big deal. Yeah, it really did. And later, he said he tried not to find new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take, and to give that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. So he turned in a draft that he wrote in a pretty short amount of time, and the Congress debated and amended his words. They took out some stuff he had in there. Much to his chagrin, I might add. He found it very painful to sit through the Congress parsing his words and editing them. He had some stuff in there blaming George III for the slave trade that kind of turned off some South Carolina delegates, and that's pretty important when we go on to discuss like Jefferson's character. Like, really, he truly was. There is a book about him with this title, but he was like an American Sphinx. Yeah, he was an enigma. He was contradictions wrapped inside themselves, in a sense. I mean, I don't know. He's really hard to describe, but yes, in the original draft,
he lambasted the slave trade.
Yeah, and the Declaration becomes, the thing he was most famous for, and also a thing that he ended up being judged, and often judged harshly against, because we hold him to the standard of the words that he made immortal, and the way he articulated the kind of things that everyone had been saying in the colonies for years. He articulated them in such a clear and poetic way that they became, pretty much the world's most famous statement of liberty.
Yeah.
And one that he and a lot of other people of his generation didn't always live up to.
Why don't you remind us in case somebody forgot?
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
That's Thomas Jefferson making his stamp on history.
Yeah.
He didn't.
And it's too bad that things kind of got twisted and perverted in a way that you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't and hasn't been and is not true equality. So the very opening volley has fallen short, in a sense.
Yeah, well, they set a bar that it would take, the whole country. We're still trying to live up to it.
Yeah. That's a high bar to set, Mr. Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing to evaluate and judge characters like this, because in a way you have to give them credit for thinking these thoughts and articulating them in a way that what's said in those words is something we all now take for granted, as obviously that's the way things are or should be.
Yeah.
Whereas back at that time, they're making this all up out of whole cloth, and they come from a world where these things were not true and were considered very new and controversial ideas. So for them to even be able to come up with them is a great accomplishment. But then at the same time, their failure to live up to them it's apparent.
Mm-hmm. Which is a shame. They're really pretty words, really noble words, but unless you can truly live up to it, and I, for one, feel that all men, that means all of humankind, everyone is created equal, and everyone is entitled to a certain little bone.
Yeah.
It's sometimes that's hard to talk about, and it actually bothers me because we haven't lived up to that. Thomas Jefferson himself didn't live up to it as a slave owner.
We have plenty of more times to visit those kind of themes coming up throughout Jefferson's life, because he kept intersecting with those values clashing with real life.
And that's just it.
Jefferson went on from Continental Congress to spend a couple years as governor of Virginia. His tenure was not all that successful one, as it occurred during a time when the British Army was invading Virginia and the state was not really ready to handle it. The executive had very little power and was kind of an extension of the legislature. So during all this time, when I know General von Steuben of the Continental Army was stationed there at the time, trying to appeal to Jefferson in the state of Virginia to get on a war footing. And kind of part of the problem with the Revolutionary War at the time is every state wanted to take care of itself.
That's it. Yeah, there wasn't a true united army, a true army of the United States, as it were.
Yeah, and Virginia doesn't want to send what little men and arms it can have to go with General von Steuben, because they want to be protecting their own homes and houses. And it ended up being, not good enough. The British Army came in led by their newest traitorous General Benedict Arnold,
Yeah.
now wearing the red coat,
Ouch.
changing uniforms mid-game, and invading Virginia. The government of Virginia, including Thomas Jefferson, fled from the capital of Richmond. They went to Charlottesville, where Jefferson's home Monticello is, and again fled from Charlottesville.
Yeah, and this didn't go unnoticed.
No, Jefferson
This actually caused a little bit of a stink.
He was roundly criticized and would spend the rest of his life having enemies call him a coward for these incidents. He was investigated by a committee who ended up clearing him of wrongdoing, but the stain remained.
Yep, sometimes the stain remains. But Jefferson tried to move on. And he was appointed minister to France, 1785 to 1789. He did some pretty decent things there. This is where his overall political ideology, I think, is molded.
Yeah, I think seeing monarchy up close really crystallized his hatred of it, and living in a huge city like Paris reaffirmed his favoritism for rural life, and it also helped foster his hatred of Britain and later favoritism of
I mean,
France.
this really did affect his foreign policy views. Time.
He was there in 1789 when the French Revolution was starting, and he saw and believed that
it was like a brotherhood type thing.
That they were following in the footsteps of our revolution, and we're going to be our brothers.
And he wanted to foster it in a sense.
And even after it diverged from that path and became a much bloodier thing,
things went out of hand over there.
He had trouble giving up the faith in it.
Yeah.
But he had some other, it wasn't all business for him in France. He was over there trying to bang a couple different married ladies. One of them was Angelica Schuyler Church, who is Hamilton's wife's sister, and she herself is famous for her role in the Hamilton musical. Jefferson tried to hook up with her. I don't think he got there. A friend of hers was another married lady named Maria Causeway. I think Jefferson might have hit that. Historians differ, but he was definitely in love with her. And there was an interesting story that I think, I guess I'll call it a conspiracy theory that I came up with. I'm loath.
Interesting. We are known for putting forth at the Dead Presidents podcast theories that are probably more than likely fact.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
It looks like we got another one for you here.
I'm loath to call it a conspiracy theory because I actually partially believe in it. But there was an incident where Jefferson was hanging out with Maria Causeway in an amorous attitude. He decided he was going to jump over a fence to impress the lady he was with.
And he fucks his wrist up,
He
right?
fell and broke his wrist. His right wrist. His writing wrist was broken. He couldn't write. And,
he came off looking like a dolt.
yeah, that was pretty much coincided with the end of his relationship with her.
Ooh, that hurts.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I feel like I've kind of been there before, but not quite so extreme circumstances of broken bone.
My
heart.
My conspiracy theory is that Jefferson has broken his right wrist. He's lost the use of his wrist, and he's now not able to, let's say, pleasure himself in the way that he may have been accustomed to doing throughout his long, or at this point, several years of widowerhood. And now
I didn't really even think about that.
Unable to find that release, he may have looked elsewhere. And if he looked around the place where he lived, he may have seen a cradle to rob.
Yeah. He may have seen the lovely Sally Hemings.
That's right. Now, Jefferson had two daughters. His oldest daughter Patsy, he brought to France with him. And actually, his younger daughters, Polly and Lucy, were left at home. Lucy was the youngest one. She died. When Jefferson found out that she died, he had Polly sent to France to come join him. And Polly came over on the boat to France in the company of a young slave, Sally Hemings, who was, I think, only about 14 years old at the time she came over.
I believe so.
Sally was the daughter of the slave Elizabeth Hemings and John Wales, who was Martha Jefferson's father.
So that's pretty wild, because that means that Sally Hemings was essentially half-sisters with Martha.
That's right. On her deathbed, Martha Jefferson extracted a promise from her husband that he would never remarry. See, her own mother had died when she was young, and she had some bad experiences with stepmothers. She didn't want her children to have a stepmother.
Yeah.
So she asked Jefferson never to remarry, and that's a promise that he kept.
Yeah.
But, and that would be very unusual
Yeah.
for an upper-class man of his time and relative youth.
Oh, for sure, because
With
he
children.
probably could have had anybody.
Yeah, he could have married.
He could have robbed from any cradle.
Yep. He could have the pick of any cradle in Virginia.
Or elsewhere, probably. Yep. I mean, he's a
But
popular guy, very smart.
But
Important.
he's in France with that broken wrist. I'm not going to give up on that theory.
Yeah.
And he looks around and he sees young Sally, who's now 16 years old, said to resemble Martha and also said to be very attractive. And regardless of what happened or may not have happened, when Sally came back to Virginia from France, she was with child. So something happened over there. And
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting because people would consider, a master going with a slave is a relationship where all the power is on one side, and the woman, essentially doesn't have a choice. But what's kind of interesting with Jefferson, this having happened in France, was the one time that Jefferson didn't have total power over Sally Hemings. Because in France, slavery was not, wasn't really legal in France. France had slavery in its colonies, but in France itself, slavery was not really legal. And when someone brought slaves into France, they were supposed to register them with the government and weren't really allowed to keep them there long term. You were allowed to bring slaves there for a short time, but you had to leave.
They were almost like indentured servants.
Well, yeah, they weren't. They
registered.
France just wasn't.
they were slaves, of course.
France just wasn't gonna.
France wasn't gonna say that they were outright slaves.
They're not gonna have a permanent slave population in France. But Jefferson, when he went over there, he didn't register his slaves. He kept it on the down low. But the thing is that the court in Paris that was in charge of this, if a slave petitioned the court for their freedom, it was granted. The court in Paris granted 100% of these petitions. So Sally Hemings could have petitioned for her freedom and stayed in France. And at the time, her brother, James Hemings, was also over there, her older brother, who Jefferson brought to be trained as a French chef. They were both over there, and they both could have stayed if they wanted to. But it was later written by Sally's son, Madison Hemings, later told the story that his mother agreed to come back with Jefferson on the condition that he would grant freedom to their children when they met the age of majority, and basically that she would have special treatment from him. And that's the deal that it seems they made, and that she came back to the United States on.
Yeah.
When she would have been totally in his power and not able to hold him to that agreement, although he did hold to it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long-term relationship. I mean, didn't they? Yeah. I mean, they had, as science has proven, they had several children.
Yeah,
didn't they?
I think she may have had as many as 7 children, and I think maybe only 4 of them lived to adulthood. But there's at least four of their children who lived, and for a long time, this was like a conspiracy theory of Jefferson scholarship, where the major biographers didn't accept this as true. But I think it's pretty much
It's
been proven true. DNA tests proved that.
Well, the biographers probably bigoted racists that didn't want to accept the fact that, my hero wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the DNA test proved that a male Jefferson did father Sally Hemings' children, and for a while people tried to pin that on some of his nephews, but it's since been basically proven that it's him.
Yeah,
and there's
I think there was a thing at we'll go into it a little bit later, but I think there was a timeline at Monticello that kind of pinpointed different things that kind of indicated that there was an odd 9-month.
Yeah, the thing
absence,
is Jefferson spent a lot of time away from home during his political career, but he was at Monticello 9 months before every time Sally Hemings gave birth.
Yeah.
So he was there at the time. Actually, when Jefferson's daughter Polly died, almost 9 months to the day afterwards, Sally Hemings gave birth. So I think he
trying to make up. He
sought solace from his daughter's death in the arms of Sally Hemings.
Wow.
There's actually a really great book. I think it won the Pulitzer Prize, called The Hemings Is of Monticello. It's basically a biography of the Hemings family and their relationship with Jefferson. That's really excellent and highly recommended.
Sounds like a good read.
Yeah, I think one of the points the book made is sometimes people will try to knock Sally Hemings for the deal that she made with Jefferson as if she's almost some kind of race traitor. But you got to understand her situation and know that her own mother had a long-term relationship with her master, and Sally's sister had a relationship with a white man who was one of Jefferson's neighbors and had children by him and asked to be sold to him, and Jefferson sold her to him. But this was a really common arrangement during this time that was always unspoken, but was a really common thing. And keep in mind that Sally Hemings, not just as a black slave, but also a woman. Women don't have many rights or opportunities at this time, and being the almost de facto wife of a guy like Thomas Jefferson is kind of the best deal a woman can expect.
Yeah.
And Sally Hemings,
let alone somebody in Sally's position,
she got that deal for herself, and
it's not that there wasn't genuine affection there either.
Yeah,
there was.
Yeah, I went into that reading that book not really expecting that, but it does seem like they did have some kind of
they cared for each other,
affectionate relationship, where they lived as, almost a secret husband and wife for years.
Yeah, and they were probably necessary for one another.
Yeah, I went into it thinking, I knew Jefferson had promised not to remarry, and thinking that he probably spent his life, regretting that decision, but I think seeing what he had with Sally meant, that he had that part of him fulfilled.
Yeah.
And didn't need to look elsewhere.
I think it definitely helped him.
Mm-hmm. So reading the Hemings Is of Monticello is interesting, but it's also it almost feels deceptive in a way that I think Thomas Jefferson was self-deceptive. Because if you see the life that the Hemings family had and the kind of special treatment that they received and the kind of deal that Sally Hemings made with Jefferson, you get the sense that the Hemingses had it about as good as it could get for slaves. So you don't see the way that most slaves lived. And the thing is that I think guys like Jefferson, who owned slaves, would tell themselves, I treat my slaves really nice. I don't beat them. I treat them humanely, and so slavery's not that bad. And that's the kind of thing that they talk themselves into believing to justify their conduct.
You're fooling yourself.
Yeah. Because Jefferson would buy and sell slaves to keep slave husband and wives together, and he, believed that he was treating his slaves well. And the thing is, like, this whole time he owned slaves his whole life, but throughout his whole political career, he's ideologically against slavery.
Right.
He's writing about it in the Declaration of Independence, that they made him take it out. But throughout his whole life, he's consistently gives anti-slavery views. He called it, quote, a moral depravity and a hideous blot.
Yeah, there's a strange hypocrisy there. And it's one thing for somebody to own slaves. It's another thing entirely to treat them poorly. And it's a third thing altogether to convince yourself that, well, I'm inconveniencing myself to make sure that I'm spending money. I'm, going out of my way to make sure that families are kept together and all this and that,
Mm-hmm.
But they're still slaves.
Yeah. Which, almost being against it was a new idea at the time, because before the American Revolution, our society was hierarchical. The king was just better than everyone because he's the king, and the nobles are better than you, and then you're better than indentured servants, and slaves are at the bottom.
Always
and that
a
was
class
just,
system.
That was just the natural way that society worked, so you almost didn't need some kind of justification for slavery. It just is the way things were. But then once guys like Jefferson start promoting the ideal that all men are created equal, and that becomes adopted as our national creed, then you look around, you start looking around yourself and thinking, this is totally inconsistent with
the reality of the situation.
Reality of our lives. And it's the guys who lived at the beginning of that time, most of them never really caught up with their own ideas in their own lives. Right. And, because at the beginning of the American...
No, they tried to cop out at the end by releasing their slaves in their wills.
Well,
or they would say, my slaves are freed upon the death of my wife if she outlives me. Washington
George Washington did that, but even most other people didn't even do that much. At the first, I think it's a great almost opportunity lost in history, because at the outbreak of the Revolution, where idealism was like at its peak, I think there would have been almost an opportunity to do something about slavery that was missed. Because
I would agree. Like, from their standpoint, they looked at it. I think they talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's records of them discussing it.
Yeah,
but they figured, we can't bring this up now.
Yeah, Jefferson.
We have to put it off. We have to put it off, and it just got put off for way too fucking long, and it's still getting ignored.
Mm-hmm.
The true situation.
Jefferson, during the Revolution, he introduced legislation in Virginia that would have resulted in abolition, and he wrote his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, where he wrote that slavery was wrong, and he believed that it was inconsistent with the laws of nature and that it was a threat to the survival of our nation. And when he published that book, he was worried about how his friends in Virginia were going to see it, and if he got a reputation of being too anti-slavery, then he's not going to be the guy who everyone is electing and looking to. And after his kind of more youthful, idealistic flourishes of it, he just let it
slide.
Let it go,
which is kind of selfish.
And it became, he claimed that, hey, we have a democracy now, and emancipation will have to be a democratic process. So until the people, meaning
It's kind of ridiculous when you say
the
it.
white men who are the only ones with the franchise, when they're ready to vote out slavery, then it will be gone. And guys like Jefferson just talked themselves into believing that that was going to happen, that the next generation was going to do it, that slavery was going to wither away, and that it was on its way out, just as a way of relieving them of the responsibility of doing anything about it.
Yeah. I think a lot of them felt like we have enough on our plate right now.
Yeah, we talked about in the
which again, selfish.
In the Washington episode, in terms of this new country being a union of different states, that silence on slavery was the price of union, because southern states wouldn't have been part of a union that was thinking about abolishing slavery.
Right.
So
there couldn't have been a country if it wasn't for slavery.
Well,
but
there probably couldn't have been a union at the outset if we weren't going to ignore slavery at the time. But that has a, obviously huge, horrifying cost in people's lives that were dominated by it. Like at the time, they thought slavery. Guys like Jefferson would talk themselves into thinking slavery was on its way out, but at the same time, there were different kind of technological advances happening that made it become even more entrenched.
Yeah, I mean, you understand where I'm coming from. It's just like kind of almost sick. Well, not almost. It is sickening to think that, well, we're not going to rebel against people that are like fucking us in the ass because we want to own people.
Yeah.
We're not going to be inconvenienced. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's easy to talk about something as an idealistic ideal, but then when it comes time to put your money where your mouth is, to get rid of slavery, they would have to massively inconvenience and overturn their way of life, and they just, as a society as a whole,
willing to accept it.
They showed no inclination to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. What a shitty situation. Like, you could rack your brain trying to think of,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if white people weren't so lazy and complacent to begin with, importing prisoners against their will wouldn't have been necessary, or quote unquote necessary.
Yep.
This is a painful topic. This is a dark moment in the Dead Presidents podcast. It's like, we try to keep it lighthearted and have fun as well as teach. But by God, there's some hard things to talk about here, and slavery is the hardest.
Jefferson wrote that maintaining slavery was like holding a wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. That was the thing.
That was basically, I guess, that was it. That's where they all saw themselves.
Yeah. They couldn't imagine a post-slavery world where they lived side by side with black people. So the whole first generation, and I guess even up to and including, I think, Lincoln, their whole abolition fantasy was that we'll end slavery and all the black people will go back and colonize Africa and we won't have to live with them.
Yeah.
They could never imagine.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's incredibly true. Like, you can't just blame, like, the South and the Southern slaveholder for prejudice and racism and bigotry, because it was just as virulent in the North. Newly freed slaves, and obviously we're going to get into this in later episodes, but newly freed slaves, they would go to the North thinking, like, oh, wow, I could begin a new life. And it's like, we're not going to hire you.
Yeah.
And the racism was equally bad and sometimes worse. I mean, they weren't slaves anymore, obviously, but I mean, they still got treated like shit, which is horse shit,
Yeah, Yeah, and people...
What did we expect them to do? Like, that's what pisses me off about the whole fucking thing. It's like, all right, hey, okay, sorry about that. You're free. Have at it. No, get out of here. We can't hire you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's bullshit. We want to take credit for freeing the people that shouldn't have been enslaved in the first place, and then when they try to make themselves into citizens, hold them back. And for a period way longer. And that continues. It's disgusting. It's really hard to fucking talk about. I don't know. Can we move away from this topic? Is this...
Sure.
Have we covered everything?
Yeah, we can move away from there. When we left the timeline of Thomas Jefferson, he was heading back from France to the United States with his new impregnated young pseudo-bride.
Yeah.
Where he had already been confirmed to become Secretary of State in the new administration. And if you're a fan of the Hamilton musical, you'll know the catchy little song that Jefferson comes in on that really lightens the mood. So you can picture that in your head to transition out of the darkest
the darkest moment in
career that we
Dead President's podcast history up to this point,
where he dances back onto the American stage as Secretary of State under George Washington's administration.
And check out the play, it'll wow ya.
In the play, it's a rap battle, but in real life and in the Dead President's podcast...
Unfortunately, in real life, it was not.
They fought and didn't rhyme, but Jefferson clashed with the Treasury Secretary, Hamilton, and that clash and the ideological differences that spawned it were the genesis of the two-party system.
Yeah, that was the catalyst for the whole two-party system.
Yep, all these guys, including...
the impetus.
Hamilton and Jefferson, they're all against parties in theory. They don't believe in party. I think Jefferson's quote was, "If I couldn't go to heaven except with a party, I wouldn't go at all." And then he created his own party.
Yep.
In all which he doesn't see that as being hypocritical at all.
Well, I don't think that he actually set out to create a party. It's just his ideology.
Is the party they created, they would not have admitted that it was a party.
Yeah.
Parties are bad, but this isn't a party.
Yeah.
This is just a group of like-minded individuals working for the betterment of the whole country.
Yeah.
And the other people are an evil faction trying to destroy us.
Yeah.
That's how both parties viewed themselves and the other. And
that continues to this day.
It kind of does. But Jefferson, he opposed Hamilton's financial policies. But the thing is, George Washington, who was a Virginian, he's supposed to be one of Jefferson's boys.
One of his boys. One of the homeboys.
He keeps siding with Hamilton on everything. And the thing that Jefferson, I don't think, really understood is that Washington had spent the whole war in the military. He and Hamilton were... The military was really the only organ of the government at the time that was actually a unified thing, and the military suffered constantly from the federal government's inability to pay for its obligations and to do anything, really. So the military guys like Washington... So
by default, who's Washington going to lean towards?
Yeah, he leans toward his brother in arms and knows what the kind of weak central government that Jefferson wants results into when push comes to shove. And so he keeps siding with Hamilton. Jefferson helped broker the deal for the federal capital on the Potomac. He hosted a dinner with Hamilton and Madison when Hamilton's bill to have the federal government assume state debt was on the table and wasn't passing. The Virginians agreed to let that pass in exchange for the federal capital going to Virginia.
We talked about that a little bit in episode 1.
Mm-hmm.
And now, time's just moving along.
Yep.
And old TJ finds himself in a contest. The first contest for the presidency.
Yep.
It's him and our boy John Adams, whom we spoke about in the previous episode.
Yep.
And we actually got a challenge here. There's no clear winner this time round.
Yep, Jefferson resigned from the cabinet. He and Madison were kind of forming their own party. When Washington retired after his second term, it was John Adams head-to-head versus Thomas Jefferson. And as you know from the Adams episode, Adams won. And
in a close one.
Jefferson served 4 years as vice president, and then the rematch.
Yeah. And what a rematch. The election of 1800. The revolution of 1800. My God, revolution?
That's what Jefferson's
We just had one of those.
Well, we spent a decade in the clutches of the monarchist federalists. We need a new one, according to Jefferson. So as you will recall from the Adams episode, the Republican Party much better organized by 1800. Aaron Burr organizes the New York State legislative campaign that takes the New York legislature for Republicans, gives them electoral college control of that swing state. So they're beating Adams now, and the electoral college comes down. It's 73-65 over Adams, but here's the rub. Thomas Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr tie with 73 electoral votes.
Uh-oh.
The Republican Party kept perfect party solidarity in casting their votes because, as you may recall, at this time, there was no official vice presidential running mate.
Right.
The electors of the college cast 2 votes, voted for 2 different guys, not distinguishing who they intended to be vice president and president. Whoever gets the most votes president, second is vice president. But if they tie, it's up to the House of Representatives to decide. And in this case, it is the lame duck Federalist House of Representatives that decides.
Uh-oh.
Not the incoming Republican one. And now all the Federalists, they all knew that Thomas Jefferson was supposed to be the president and Burr be the vice president. But they're thinking, maybe Burr isn't going to be as bad. Maybe we should put him in there instead. And so a lot of Federalists are voting for Burr, and the House of Representatives is deadlocked. They deadlock for 35 ballots, not able to choose a winner.
Tense.
It's very tense.
Anxiety.
And it was a very far-reaching controversy that for decades afterward was fought over. Jefferson's people claiming that Burr was trying to scheme to get himself elected, and Burr's people claiming that Jefferson was scheming. And neither side, they all went to the grave sticking to their stories.
Not knowing who was the true schemer.
But in the end, a couple states broke for Jefferson. He won, and he started off with a very sour relationship with his vice president. Aaron Burr's friends weren't getting any of the federal appointments in New York. And that ended up having more far-reaching consequences, as this won't be the last time we hear from Burr.
No, it won't. Certainly an interesting character.
But that makes Thomas Jefferson the victor of the election of 1800. He is about to take office as the 3rd president, and we will be exploring his 8 years as president just as soon as we get back after this word from our sponsors.
Thanks for listening. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Jane Nice's German Hall. Green turtle soup will be ready to serve up this day at 11 o'clock at J. Nice's on Carpenter Street, sign of German Hall, behind Gray's Brewery. Ladies and gentlemen, whatever your lunch plans were, cancel them. Get your asses down to J. Nice's, where the green turtle soup is to die for. Not only that, James, they've got some great craft beers on tap from Gray's Brewery. Tell them the Dead President's podcast sent you, and your first beer is on the house. That's a great deal. You can't go wrong with J. Nice's German Hall.
Now a word from our sponsor, Thomas Pritchard. Whereas my wife, Nancy Pritchard, has deserted my bed and board, willfully neglected to perform any of the duties of a virtuous wife, and uniformly displayed an unparalleled and insatiable spirit of lasciviousness and disaffection, by which means I have for 10 years experienced all the horrors of a dreadful purgatory. I therefore publicly caution all persons against trading with her or crediting her on my account, as I am determined not to be answerable for any of her contracts. Listeners, if you didn't know that Nancy Pritchard has a boundless and unquenchable appetite for extramarital fornication, you sure know now. We here at the Dead President's Podcast hope that Thomas Pritchard's decade-long nightmare has finally ended, and that he gets a chance to start his life over, perhaps with a new wife who's a little more virtuous.
Listeners, marital strife goes both ways. Our next sponsor is a wronged wife. Freelove McIntosh gives this notice. Eloped from my bed and board, one William McIntosh, who is supposed to be my husband, and refuses to return and live peaceably with me, but treats me very ill, with cudgels, staves, and canes. He beats and thwacks me very severely, spends my property, and has taken from me all my furniture, bed, and bedding, and refuses to return them to me again, runs me in debt, and spends my property very fast. This notice is therefore to caution any person against trusting or harboring him on my account, as I shall not pay any more debts of his contracting after this date. Damn! This William McIntosh character sounds like an epic piece of shit. He has no right to treat Freelove that way. She is a nice lady. In fact, I wouldn't mind seeing her and Thomas Pritchard get together. The two of them have been through a hell of a lot, and they really deserve partners who will show some respect and at the very least live peaceably with them.
Is that too much to ask?
But this could be a perfect match, made right here on the Dead President's Podcast. Thomas, Freelove, if you're interested, hit us up on Twitter at DeadPresPodcast with a Z, and we'll set you up on an all-expenses-paid dinner date to J. Nice's German Hall, where you could canoodle over a couple bowls of the best green turtle soup this side of the Atlantic. Nothing wrong with canoodling with noodles. A little noodle canoodle, baby.
And now back to our show.
And we're back and ready to dive in to the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. So, as he said in his inaugural address, we are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. But privately, he vowed to sink federalism into an abyss from which there shall be no resurrection.
And that's why he and his people called it the Revolution of 1800. They got in there, controlling the presidency and the Congress, and set about undoing a lot of the shenanigans that they felt were Federalist crap that they didn't like.
Yep.
And changing the ideological direction of the federal government.
So let's get federal judges out of there.
They repealed the Judiciary Act, got rid of the midnight appointments, well, most of them.
Yeah.
Chief Justice
Obviously,
Marshall
we
still
mentioned
there.
John Marshall
And they, in
the previous episode. He stuck around for quite a long time.
The Republicans looked around and saw that the judiciary is the only place the Federalists still had power, and they wanted to destroy that power, and they started impeaching some judges. They removed one guy from office and then lost the impeachment trial on another guy, so that didn't really go too much farther, but they tried.
Yeah.
They repealed the whiskey tax and some other taxes. They cut government spending. They passed a bill to cut the size of the Army and the Navy. A lot of the Navy ships were laid up in dry dock, so they didn't have to pay for them or man them.
Then we have a pretty big change in terms of a constitutional amendment.
Yeah, the 12th Amendment changed the presidential election procedures to allow for a separate vice presidential vote.
Thank goodness.
So the
After
shenanigans...
that malarkey, we need something that's going to work.
That kind of crap won't happen again going forward, so there won't be any more opposition party vice presidents or accidental ties. We'll have legit vice presidential running mates from now on.
Nice.
One of the big events of Jefferson's presidency was the Barbary War, which was, I've heard it called...
not another war.
The United States' first war on terror.
Oh.
It was called. The Barbary States were states along the northern coast of Africa that were...
mainly pirates.
Yeah, they were piratical. They were Muslim little monarchies that lived by piracy against other countries' shipping in the Mediterranean. And a lot of countries, they extorted tribute from everybody. Like, you had to pay them off or be victims of piracy. And the United States, back from the 1780s, when Jefferson and Adams were diplomats, they were like, why are we, we don't want to take this shit from the Barbary States. This is embarrassing to pay tribute to someone. But at the time, the United States had no strong federal government, no navy, no ability to do anything about it.
Nothing to speak of.
But Jefferson didn't forget about that, and when he became president, he sent the Navy into the Mediterranean to show down the Barbary States. And it didn't go well at first. One of the ships ran aground, and its whole crew got captured and was held for ransom.
Ouch!
But
bad start.
We came back. I think it was Stephen Decatur led the raid against that ship that had been captured. He raided it and burned it, and William Eaton led a land army that captured the city of Derna and forced the Barbary States into submission. Where I read a book about this, or I listened to the audiobook, and at first it really pissed me off the way the Barbary States acted. Like, I was so excited for us to go over there and beat the shit out of them and stop paying tribute. This is insulting. And at the end, it kind of like, the Barbary War kind of ended with a whimper more than a bang, because we did win, but we still paid them ransom to let our guys go, and still almost paid like a nominal tribute going forward until, again, in the year 1815, there was another Barbary War that finally ended the tribute. But this was something Jefferson had sticking in his craw for years that he finally took care of when he was president.
Yeah. Another huge deal. And I mean a huge deal.
The biggest deal.
We're talking the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana was a French territory until the end of the French and Indian War, and it was transferred to Spain. The U.S. would have liked to have had it, but Spain was like, we'd rather have that as a nice buffer, a nice safety zone, to protect our lucrative colony of Mexico.
Yeah, Spain didn't like having the expansionist United States on the border of their colonies. But in 1801, Spain was allies with France, and Napoleon, the new ruler of France, kind of strong-armed Spain into giving Louisiana back to France. So Napoleon had a dream of recolonizing Louisiana, and he sent an army to Haiti, which was another French colony, with the expectation that after that army put down the slave rebellion in Haiti, that it would then go on to Louisiana and recolonize Louisiana.
Didn't quite work out.
Fortunately for the United States, the French army never made it off of Haiti. The Haitian Revolution succeeded, and Napoleon's army died mostly of disease in Haiti.
Yeah.
And his dream of recolonization was dead. So he sat there on the verge of breaking out in war with Britain again, and knowing that Britain's mastery of the seas would make it easy for Britain to take Louisiana away from him.
Yeah, he's bogged down and he needs money.
So rather than see Louisiana seized by the British, he sells it to the United States. And Thomas Jefferson is happy to oblige and received a huge windfall in land and popularity for himself.
Yeah. I mean, it doubled the size of the United States. He bought it for $15 million, which was something like, what, 2 cents an acre or something?
Yeah,
crazy
something like
shit.
that.
I mean, it was so crazy that Jefferson himself pondered the constitutional. Was it constitutionally sound for him to do that?
Yeah,
He questioned it.
Yeah,
He wasn't sure if that was within his power.
Yeah, because he had a narrow view of the Constitution, or he certainly had one when it was Hamilton's policies that were being enacted.
Yeah.
But now that he's president, he's like, thinking maybe we need a constitutional amendment to add new territory, but this is too good of a deal to get bogged down in.
Yeah, I mean, it was like he was unsure of whether or not it was legal, but it was such a good offer that
it was an offer he couldn't refuse.
Yeah.
And along with the Louisiana Purchase, we have the intrepid Meriwether Lewis and his companion
William Clark. Jefferson was keen on exploring the Pacific Northwest even before the Louisiana Purchase. He had Lewis cooking up this expedition when it wasn't our territory, and they asked Spain, hey, would you mind? We want to go on just a purely scientific, geographic expedition into this territory. And they're like, yes, we do mind. I think we think you have ulterior motives for this journey.
They were trying to get the show on the road.
But then the Purchase came through, and it was our territory now. So Lewis and Clark, with the Corps Discovery, went up the Missouri River from St. Louis.
On one of the greatest adventures ever.
They were gone about 2.5 years. They made it to the Pacific Ocean. The whole goal of the expedition, the main goal, was they were hoping to find a convenient all-water route to the Pacific.
No dice.
And no dice. It was a grueling route to the Pacific that they finally made it there and made it back, and it really opened up. It was the first step towards opening up all that land to U.S. control, and that was our first really meeting with all the Indian tribes up there. Lewis and Clark would meet with the Indians and then encourage the Indians to send representatives to Washington to meet the president and open up what became a huge trading empire.
And of course they had the help of the wonderful Sacagawea.
Yep. She was their interpreter.
An interpreter, yeah.
Some other consequences of the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson is a big will of the people kind of guy, and he believes in the virtue of the people to protect, the integrity of the revolution and its values. But then we just straight up buy people who
Yeah.
don't hold the same kind of American values, who don't necessarily believe in our democracy or anything.
Seems odd.
They're French, they're Spanish, they're used to living under a monarchical form of government, and then...
And that's not to mention the actual, like, Native Americans that were living there, but they're already getting screwed. Like,
So at first, particularly in New Orleans, which was the big main crown jewel of the Louisiana Purchase, that's the city that controls the Mississippi River. A lot of the people there were not totally thrilled with being part of the United States, and then to top it off, when they come in, they're a territorial government. They're not a state.
Yeah, can you imagine, like, you're living someplace and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, you're part of the United States now.
Yeah.
Hey, welcome.
They were Spain, and then Spain gave them to France, and then France sold them to the United States.
Poor people, like, they didn't know what the hell was going on.
Yeah, and they're being told, hey, the United States is great, we're a democracy, but you don't get to vote for anything yet.
Yeah.
Because you're a territory. The
Just
president...
be thankful you're part of it.
The president is going to appoint the governor, and he's going to have veto power over everything you do, and you're not allowed to import slaves, even though states are allowed to import slaves. And slave owners in New Orleans were not happy about that. So New Orleans was kind of very full of unrest for a time. And in that time...
somebody took advantage of that.
Somebody did try to take advantage.
They tried.
Our former Vice President, Aaron Burr, after Thomas Jefferson's first term... Burr was dropped from the ticket. Once he realized he was not going any further in Jefferson's administration, he tried running for governor of New York and lost. Then he killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, and he was kind of at the bottom of the
bottom of the chain.
He'd hit bottom.
Yeah.
And he's trying to bounce back.
So he comes up with a little scheme.
Yep. A little scheme that is known now as the Bur Conspiracy. So Burr was plotting a comeback that involved a plan to raise kind of a private army and conquer Spanish colonies like Texas and Mexico.
That's a pretty ambitious comeback.
It is. A lot of people, a bunch of people, a lot of Americans wanted to go to war with Spain at this time. Spain was very weak, and Americans saw these lands as sitting ducks that should be ours. But Jefferson was against war, and so guys like Burr were trying to make it happen on their own. So he possibly considered trying to make himself Emperor of Mexico. And also, the even darker aspect of the plan is that it could have included attempts to separate the western states from the United States, that the disaffected people of New Orleans might have declared independence from the United States.
So we're talking some serious shit.
If you control the mouth of the Mississippi River, you're going to control the destiny of Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio.
Yeah, all of that commerce.
Everything from Pittsburgh west.
Yeah. So that's huge.
So it was it ended up being kind of
He thought it was a plausible idea.
Yeah.
In theory, I guess it could have been.
Yeah.
Had it had the proper support, but it just didn't.
Yeah, he ended up not being able to raise as much money as quickly as he wanted to, and the longer that this kind of hung out there, the more rumors about it that would get around, and the more heat that would come on it. And it ended up being that his co-conspirator, who was James Wilkinson, who was the top general in the U.S. Army, he was the guy in charge of our military. He was in cahoots with Burr.
That's astounding.
And when push came to shove, Wilkinson thought the heat was too much, and he turned against Burr and exposed him He declared martial law in New Orleans and rounded up some of Burr's friends. Wilkinson all doing this, all pretending like he had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Just to cover his own ass. Burr got arrested, was charged with treason. And thanks to Chief Justice Marshall, who presided at the trial and gave a narrow interpretation to the constitutional definition of treason, Burr was acquitted for lack of evidence. Because he hadn't actually been present at the time that some of his compadres were allegedly gathering, and the plot to do something never occurred. At the time, it was not a crime to conspire to commit treason. You had to actually do it. And because it all fell apart before it happened, Burr kind of got off on a technicality.
But, I mean, this was, I don't know. Is this not, like, kind of a step beyond actually just plotting something?
Well, I think...
Like, they were acting to do this.
I think with the, hindsight of history, it's easy to say that, but in terms of the evidence that they had in court at the time, it was a lot more vague, especially because their star witness was Wilkinson, who
denied everything.
Who was in on it while pretending that he wasn't, and they had to rely on him as their witness, and he came off looking real bad to where most people believed that he was in on it, and so he wasn't a reliable witness.
Wow.
And the case fell apart. But Jefferson, he went all out. He gave a message to Congress, declaring that Burr was committing treason, before he was arrested.
Yeah.
There's a controversy during the Charles Manson trial that Manson got a look at the headline where Nixon declared Manson to be guilty, as if he's not getting a fair trial because the president declared his guilt.
Yeah.
But Jefferson did that to Burr, and they declared martial law, and they arrested people and sent them out of New Orleans to Virginia, where they arguably had no jurisdiction. And Jefferson had the Republicans in the Senate debated. They had a secret debate on whether they should suspend habeas corpus for people charged with treason. And then the House openly debated that and voted it down. But some people, I think it was
crazy shit.
John Quincy Adams said something to the effect of, I don't know who comes off worse in this, Burr, who may have been committing treason, or Jefferson and his cronies, who may have been, bending the law to persecute somebody.
Wow. What a shit show. Speaking of which, that's going to bring us to our next topic, which is another one that is just bound to piss me off beyond my capability of rational speech.
And that's
Indian policy.
Yeah, that's our Indian policy, where, kind of like with slavery, it's also an issue where a guy like Jefferson will tell himself one thing and do another thing. And
all too common.
I'm going to read a long quote from Jefferson because it's pretty much, I feel like, a perfect encapsulation of U.S. Indian policy.
Yeah, it pretty much is. Yeah,
And
sadly, it
just
is.
Watch the way this quote starts and then the way
how it ends
up.
Really, listeners, pay attention to this. These are the words of our third president, Thomas Jefferson, but more so, they are a summation of our policy towards the people that were actually living on this land when we decided to show up and take it over. Take it away, James.
Our system is to live in perpetual peace with the Indians, to cultivate an affectionate attachment for them by everything just and liberal which we can do for them within the bounds of reason, and by giving them effectual protection against the wrongs from our own people. When they withdraw themselves to the culture of a small piece of land, they will perceive how useless to them are the extensive forests, and will be willing to pare them off in exchange for necessaries for their farms and families. To promote this, we shall push our trading houses, and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them in debt, because we observe when these debts go beyond what the individual can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands. But should any tribe refuse the proffered land and take up the hatchet, it will be driven across the Mississippi and the whole of its lands confiscated.
So that's a steaming pile of bullshit.
Yep.
I hate it.
That was the policy, and there were several major treaties ceding land during Jefferson's administration.
Yeah. And that kind of attitude continued for ever. Yeah. It's a fucking travesty. Let's move on to the embargo. Another travesty. This really tainted Jefferson's second term badly.
Yeah, Jefferson's first term, was very successful. He had the Louisiana Purchase. He coasted to a dominating re-election and was really flying high. His second term was a lot more rocky. That's when he had to face the Bur Conspiracy, and that's when he really starts to have problems in economic policy. Because the U.S. maintained neutrality in the war between Britain and France. We wanted to trade with both of them, but
Jefferson's a Francophile.
Neither of them wanted neutral powers trading with the enemy, and so both France and Britain are seizing American merchant ships. Britain is persisting in the practice of impressment.
For the king.
The forced conscription of sailors into the Royal Navy.
For the peace of the kingdom.
Including a lot of people who considered themselves to be American citizens. Britain didn't... when somebody goes over from Britain to America and becomes an American citizen, Britain doesn't really think they're allowed to get away that easy, and will still conscript them off of an American ship, including the infamous Chesapeake incident, where a Royal Navy ship fired on an American Navy ship and impressed sailors right off of it in a huge controversy. But Jefferson and his boys are anti-war. They reduced the Army and the Navy. They're not about incurring the expense of war. They think that they can use economic sanctions as a substitute for war. And if they stop trading with Britain and France, then Britain and France will change their policies and let us be neutral. So Jefferson's administration enacted an embargo banning all trade between the United States and Britain and France. And
which was a horrible decision for the U.S. economy.
Didn't really work.
No, not at all.
Britain
I mean,
and France,
if he was trying to save face and say, like, well, both of you piss off, which basically it seems kind of like it was it.
Yeah.
He was basically trying to be like, well, I don't need either of you, hoping that maybe they'd buckle.
Yeah.
No, didn't happen, and the United States economy was crippled.
Yeah. Britain and France didn't even really notice.
Yeah.
And the embargo, it was impossible to enforce because everyone just smuggled everything.
Yeah.
So there was massive smuggling.
Smugglers.
But it crippled the U.S. economy. I think they lost many, many millions of dollars in revenue because most federal revenue came off taxing imports and exports.
Yeah.
So that utterly failed, and before Jefferson left office, it was quietly repealed.
Yeah.
And,
so he saw the error of his ways.
That whole situation ended up leading to the War of 1812.
Yeah.
During Jefferson's successor.
Which we'll talk about next time.
Yeah. We're almost to the end of Jefferson's presidency. Before we finish,
let's get into something scandalous.
I
want to talk about something salacious.
2 different scandalous accusations that Jefferson endured during his presidency. James T. Callender, who we talked about during the Adams episode as someone who was imprisoned under the Sedition Act.
That's right.
He was the guy who was responsible for exposing Hamilton's extramarital affair.
Yeah.
And he was in jail
The
under the
dirty
Sedition
sod.
Act for... he was the guy who called Adams a hideous hermaphroditical character.
Yeah, that was, we talked about that last episode. What a virulent, just, my God, what a fucking burn. Like, that was a horrid insult.
That bought him some jail time, but Jefferson pardoned him and refunded the fine that he paid, but Callender thought that he was owed more by Jefferson because he'd been doing the dirty work of attacking Jefferson's rivals, and now that Jefferson's president, Callender wants to be a postmaster. Jefferson doesn't appoint him. They kind of know that this Callender guy's like a slimy character. They don't want to be too involved
A real
with him.
sleaze bag.
So they elbow him out, but Callender, he's not going to take that lying down.
He's not done. Like any sleaze bag, he's going to bounce back dirtier than ever.
He goes on a little investigative trip over to Charlottesville, and in 1802, he publishes for the world the allegation that Thomas Jefferson is having children with his slave, Sally Hemings.
What a dirty sod.
So the Sally Hemings controversy starts in Jefferson's own lifetime.
What a fucking rotter.
And when this came out, he pretty much just ignored it. He never even really dignified it with a response. And it happened in his first term.
It would have been more badass if he just said, yeah, it's true, so what?
Yeah. But he didn't acknowledge it at all. And I guess...
And then he should have freed all of his slaves and told everybody else that they should do the same.
What might have been.
Yeah, I got carried away.
Instead, the Louisiana Purchase probably controlled the news cycle.
Yeah.
And everyone forgot about what Jefferson made.
Yeah, to put it in a modern perspective, that's probably right.
Nobody cares about Sally Hemings anymore because we just got
huge tracts of land.
So nobody cared enough about that to do anything about it at the time. Then in 1805, Jefferson's old friend and neighbor, Robert Walker, accused Jefferson of making inappropriate advances to his wife in the 1780s.
What?
This was a long simmering dispute that broke out when he was president. Walker challenged Jefferson to a duel over this, but it was settled quietly. Jefferson squashed the potential duel by admitting, quote, "When young and single, I offered love to a handsome lady. I acknowledge its incorrectness." That's the kind of, like, apology / like, retraction that a guy needs to make to avoid a duel. That's the kind of thing that Hamilton, like, wouldn't say to Burr. But Jefferson backed off real quick on this, because he's not the dueling kind.
No, he's a pacifist, really, at heart.
Yeah, allegedly, while his neighbor is a married man, that Jefferson keeps, like, throwing himself at the guy's wife, and her not taking the bait.
I don't know. Jefferson was such a chameleon of a character. One kind of wonders if he was just fucking around. Like, if he didn't really actually mean anything by it, if he was just being like, I'm Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, who knows?
I mean, because obviously, he was into Sally Hemings. He might have just been fucking with this guy.
Yeah. Well, this would have been before Sally Hemings. This was even... Well... Yeah, this was before Sally Hemings.
Was it?
It was the mid-'80s, I guess, before he went to France, but I guess after his wife died? Or maybe it was... I don't
know.
This might have actually happened before he even got married. Jefferson. I think it was actually before he was married.
Okay.
And then the Walkers...
That would make more sense.
The Walkers kept a lid on this for a long time.
Okay.
So Jefferson's presidency ends maybe with a whimper more than a bang. They kind of limp out on the embargo not working, but Jefferson's promise to sink federalism into the abyss was kind of made good.
Yeah.
And by this time, there's no real opposition.
Yeah, they and we talked about it. Hamilton kind of helped to bring about the end of his own party.
Yep. And by this time, Jefferson to his credit, adheres to the George Washington precedent of 2 terms. I think Jefferson was pretty eager to be done anyway.
Yeah. He had a rough second term. He was ready to get the hell out of there. He was never comfortable in public. He wasn't a great speaker. Mm-mm. He was kind of socially awkward all of his life. And he was not comfortable with the more ceremonial duties of the presidency. Mm-hmm. He had a hard time at state dinners and different things where he would be expected to speak and make toasts and stuff. He was always uncomfortable. He was the kind of guy that, and it's been written about, he would answer the door himself in his robe and slippers.
Yeah.
And journalists were, like, horrified. This slovenly guy, was the president of the United States, but, like, that was just how he was as a person, he just...
Yeah, in part it was almost kind of like a pose that he struck of Republican simplicity to combat.
Too. Yeah, I think that, pose is the right word. I think that played into it.
Because, sometimes people complained that President George Washington was too formal, and Jefferson really went out of his way to be informal.
To be one of the people.
To the point,
he wasn't,
to the point where he insulted foreign ambassadors with informal treatment.
Yeah.
When there was the so-called Mary incident where Anthony Mary was ambassador from Britain, where they had dinner and Mary's supposed to be the guest of honor, and so the president should probably be the one escorting Mary's wife to the dinner table, but Jefferson's not adhering to any of these kind of formalities, so Mary's wife is just forgotten, and nobody, I don't know about forgotten, but the president didn't escort
her. It's overlooked.
She didn't get the formal treatment that ambassadors were expected to, and Mary was the one who was horrified of Jefferson.
She felt shunned.
Answering the door in his pajamas. So James Monroe was the U.S. ambassador to Britain at the time, and it got to the point where Monroe was getting snubbed in Britain as retaliation for the way Mary felt he was being mistreated.
Ouch.
And people would be ignoring the Monroes at parties over in Britain and giving them the cold shoulder as retaliation.
Yeah.
For Jefferson's casual treatment.
Wow.
Yeah,
ain't that some shit?
Yeah, Monroe
getting the short end of the stick.
He negotiated a potential replacement to the Jay Treaty that expired. Monroe's treaty didn't address impressment, and when it got sent back, Jefferson and Madison and everybody, they didn't like this treaty. They thought it was too good of a deal for Britain, so they never even submitted the treaty to the Senate. They just let it lapse, and Monroe was pretty pissed about it. When he came back from abroad, he was really like on the outs with Jefferson and Madison, and some people, a faction of the Republicans, wanted to elect Monroe over Madison in 1808 because they thought Jefferson and Madison were a little too big for their britches.
Wow.
And Monroe was almost seen as like an anti-Jefferson candidate at the time.
Yeah. That's interesting. And, obviously we're going to be delving into that in the next 2 episodes, of course. And just as a private aside, I've always felt that of the initial, founding father presidents, James Monroe is kind of like the curious character, the enigma figure amongst them.
Well, we'll be figuring him out in a couple episodes.
Yeah.
Our listeners will know more about James Monroe than they ever thought possible.
Yes, that is true.
Until then,
and
he'll be
at this point, you probably know more than Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, or George Washington than you've ever known, but we're not quite finished with Thomas Jefferson. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty. We're approaching the end times.
The post-presidency. His chosen successor, Madison, becomes president. who'd been his Secretary of State, and the Jeffersonian Party has total dominance over the elected branches of government.
And we're starting to see a trend with the Secretary of State position, too. And that's going to come into play big time. But
Yeah.
we're seeing like kind of it's the Vice President, the Secretary of State. Those seem to be turning into
becoming the stepping stone
to the presidency. It's getting there.
Jefferson retired in relative triumph. And let's see, what did he spend the rest of his life doing?
Being in debt, for one.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, he was a guy that spent way beyond his means because when he wanted, I don't know, I could almost relate to that, although I haven't really gone outside of my means, but when he wanted something, he got it.
Yeah.
He wouldn't let anything stop himself from getting it. And we're going to talk about our visit to Monticello in a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, he was
not one to limit himself.
No, he was constantly renovating and remaking Monticello. Just anytime he wanted a book, he'd buy books, which were very expensive at the time. He spent a prodigious amount of money on wine.
Oh, yeah.
Was interested in getting all kind of wines from all over.
And one interesting thing about all of this is he kept, like, incredibly detailed records of literally everything. Every expense.
Yeah, he recorded every expense, but he never went and added them all up.
No.
To, budget himself.
No. It was all down, but he never looked further than it was done.
Yeah, the Virginia planter class, like the guys like Jefferson, they were always in debt. They were land rich and cash poor. And they were always in debt for cash, and they believed that they have this land to fall back on, and like if things go really wrong, they could sell their land, that their land would redeem their debts. And so they never really acknowledged the seriousness of their debts the way they needed to. Jefferson ended up signing as a guarantor to a friend on some investment that went south that caused him to owe a lot more money. And when he died, he was over $100,000 in debt. And within a couple years of his death, his family had to sell Monticello and its furnishings to pay his debts.
Well, there's a fortunate addendum to that, in that Monticello didn't slip into private hands.
Yeah.
And get ruined.
Yeah, it ended up in the state of Virginia bought it.
Yeah.
And it ended up being kept up and is now open.
A pretty awesome historical site to visit, as we'll get into. But, yeah, he didn't exactly die prosperous.
No.
You know, and it's wild to me because Grant, we talked about Grant in the first episode's top 5. He was in the same boat. He made a really shitty business decision and got screwed and was bankrupt. He didn't have anything, and he was dying. And so he wrote his autobiography to try and get enough money for his family. And here's Jefferson, one of the greatest writers among the founding fathers. And he dies in debt.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of wild?
Yeah, it's weird. He did keep, he had all his personal papers in order and was protecting his legacy, and he put all his stuff together to be published after his death.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't, destitute you would think of. He wasn't on the fucking street. I mean, he still had it pretty goddamn good. It's just he didn't have any money to speak of.
Yeah, he had to... he sold his library to Congress for, $24,000 or something. It was over 6,000 volumes that replenished after the War of 1812, when our library was burned. Jefferson sold his books to reconstitute the Library of Congress. that helped get him out of debt.
And helped us to learn.
Yeah. And that's...
He absolutely contributed some stellar works.
Yeah, you can see his books in the Library of Congress.
That's one, we talked about the Adams Library. Jefferson had nothing on the Adams Library, but by God, he was a man of taste and had some great works. Fortunately, there are those that survive.
Yeah, his debts kind of shed a little bit of light if you think, hey, he talked all this, big game about being against slavery, but then he didn't free his slaves when he died. When you think about his debts and the way that a lot of men of his class had these debts, they can't free their slaves because they don't really own their slaves free and clear. They're all encumbered by debt. It's almost like they have a mortgage on their slave. And if you own your house mortgaged to a bank, you can't just burn your house to the ground because you feel like it. So they own property that's valued in slaves, and if they were to free their slaves, it's like they're just wasting property that they're not really allowed to do when they're in debt.
Banks at the time, they would look at it as a total forfeiture. Right? Is that what you're saying? Like the slaves were factored in as the property?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, when you're in huge amounts of debt... So
if you free your slaves, then you forfeit that value that your said property is worth or what have you. That seems like insane. But
Jefferson did free a few slaves when he died. He lived up to a deal that he made many years earlier to Sally Hemings. The children he had with her, a few years before his death, his two oldest children with Sally Hemings were quietly allowed to, quote-unquote, run away, where they weren't formally freed. Now, here's an important fact to keep in mind about Jefferson and Sally Hemings' children, is they were 7/8 white.
Yeah.
Sally Hemings' mother was half black, half white.
Right.
Sally
she was
Hemings,
the product of the same thing.
Sally Hemings would be 3/4 white.
Right.
And so Jefferson's children they looked white. And the first two of them left and lived their lives as white people. And they weren't formally freed, because if they had been formally freed, then that would have created a legal record that they had been a slave.
Yeah. And so they tried to avoid any of that.
Yeah, they just slipped away and lived as if they had been free white people their whole lives.
Wow.
And then when Jefferson died, his other two children were freed in his will, which was a more on the down low way to do it, because otherwise if you free someone, you have to basically file a document like you file a deed for a house that anyone can go and look up and see who's a slave and who's not. Doing it in a will was a more secretive way. And people talk about how he never freed Sally Hemings. That was just another way. She was, as a practical matter, free to do whatever she wanted. Yeah. Freeing her formally would have caused more problems for her. Right. And I think it was may have been the law of Virginia at the time that if you can free a slave, but the slave has to leave Virginia unless you get special permission.
He tried to make it as good for as he could. I mean, none of it's fucking right.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say that any of it's fucking right. Hypocrite, slave owner, but there was actually, I think, some love in his heart when it came to Sally Hemings and their offspring. I think he took that seriously. And, I don't know. Who's to say if circumstances were different? That's no excuse, of course, but... Yeah.
It's hard to judge them by a modern standard. I don't know. They're born into a world where slavery exists and it's the norm, and their parents own slaves and pass them on to these guys. But at the same time, like we said towards the beginning of the episode, Jefferson and his revolutionary generation articulated the standards of freedom that we then judge them by.
Right.
and they come up wanting.
So they set the bar higher than they could live up to.
We give them credit for setting the bar high and then criticize them for not living up to it.
Right.
While we and our whole nation are still, all these years later, struggling to live up to it.
Sadly. Well, I
Thomas
think that's
Jefferson,
going to bring us...
he died on the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence.
Yep, and we mentioned in the last episode, John Adams' last words were, Thomas Jefferson still lives, but it's not true. Several hours before, Jefferson was dying in bed, and his last words were, "Is it the 4th?"
Hung on just long enough.
Just long enough to find out that he lived to see 50 years of something that he had devoted himself to.
And we'll talk about our trip to Monticello and wrap things up right after a word from our sponsors.
Thanks for listening.
The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Captain Benjamin Walton of the 6th Infantry Regiment, who publishes this notice. $10 reward for apprehension of a deserter. Deserted from the rendezvous at Bristol, one William Alexander, born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, age 35 years, 5 feet 9 inches high, a dark complexion, blue eyes, brown hair, and by occupation a farmer, very much addicted to liquor and very quarrelsome when so. Whoever returns the above-named deserter to this rendezvous or delivers him to any officer or lodges him in any jail in the United States shall receive the $10 reward and all reasonable charges. You heard that, listeners. Be on the lookout for that low-life deserter, William Alexander.
Scum.
But be careful. He's probably very drunk and very belligerent. Proceed with caution, but don't miss your chance to claim that $10 reward.
Now, an important message from our sponsor, John Bournes. Whereas my wife Elizabeth Catherine Bournes, alias Trent, has eloped from my bed and board without any just cause, this notice is to caution the public not to credit her on my account, as I am determined not to pay any debts of her contracting. There you have it, listeners. Elizabeth Bournes has absconded from her marital bed for no apparent reason. An all too common story. I'm not sure what's going on here, but it sounds like John Bournes is an innocent victim. Be careful lending money to this runaway bride.
Well, this is awkward. Our next sponsor is Elizabeth Bournes.
Oh,
and
wow.
she has a response to that last ad.
My goodness.
Truth must prevail. Whereas John Bournes has falsely published that his wife Elizabeth Bournes hath eloped from his bed and board, justice to the public, as well as to myself and children, compels me, however painful, to make known the facts.
My God.
Whereas my husband, the said John Bournes, has deserted his house, home, and family, and left me with 5 small children to support and no money to support them with. And as I am willing to support them myself, and only pray that he in future may not interrupt me in that pursuit, and I hope the public may be generous enough not to trust him on the credit of what little I may accumulate by my frugality and industry.
Holy shit.
Elizabeth Bournes with the clap back. Oh, how the tables have turned. Deadbeat husband and father, John Bournes, leaves his wife and 5 children and tries to pin the blame on her? Not on this podcast.
No, sir.
If you've been falsely accused of abandoning your spouse, hit us up on Twitter at Dead Pres Podcast and sponsor an ad to set the record straight. On the Dead Presidents Podcast, truth must prevail.
That is absolutely correct. Hashtag fact. And I'm going to retract my previous statement that I had made, saying that this was an important message from our sponsor, John Bournes.
I think we're going to refund John Bournes' money.
Scumbag.
We're not going to run.
Yeah,
his
I don't
ads on
want.
this show
I don't
anymore.
want that dirty, that filthy lucre.
Nope.
Get that filthy lucre out of this podcast, boy. My God. Terrible.
Now back to our show.
We've been talking about our third president, Thomas Jefferson. I'm sure you've learned a hell of a lot. And we here at the podcast, we look at this as not only an intellectual journey for you, but it's proven an intellectual journey for us as well. And quite literally, as we've stated before, we've been to like 20 different presidential homes. And among them was Monticello. And wow, what a place.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the overall most impressive.
It's
of all the
incredibly
homes.
impressive. I mean, you're talking barometers and clocks and gauges that drop through the floor that tell you like the cycle of the moon and shit, I think it was. Something like that. Crazy.
Yeah,
And they
it's
would
really
have to
nice.
reset them every like 12 hours or something like that to make sure they were accurate. It's like somebody's job to do that.
You can really see how he died in so much debt because he was definitely putting the money into his house.
Oh, yeah. He had, like, in his bed, like, the bed he died in,
Mm-hmm.
he had, like, a compact shelf, like, in the wall above the bed with books. And he had a pulley with a wire that went down the floor under the carpet and over to the main door to the room that he could pull on to let people in.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't have to get up. I mean, we're talking some wild stuff in here, and we mentioned earlier that, like, he lost a lot of stuff. You know, they only have some.
Yeah, all of his furnishings were sold, and then, I mean, there were efforts to buy it all back and then replace with.
Well, and in
other
terms of
things.
his books and things like that,
Yeah.
too, you know, I mean, he's lost probably almost as much as has been retained.
Yeah, I think he has the wine cellar there with the dumbwaiter. Did he invent the dumbwaiter? He might
I
be
don't know that he
credited-
invented it, but he, like, improved upon the design.
Yeah. He was all about.
I think I
The
remember the
dumbwaiter.
tour guide, like, talking about that a little bit. Like, and he didn't, like, outright invent it. It was a concept, but he came up with some things that he felt improved it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was that kind of dude. You come up with a wild invention, and he'll find something wrong with it and fix it. You know?
Yeah.
And make it better.
He had a very nice wine cellar. I remember there was the part where I think I took your picture by it, like a little off from the house. There's like a shaft that comes
Yeah.
up out of where the house, I guess the basement is, and then it lets out like on a hill over by the side, and it was called the Privy Vent.
Yeah, the
Which
Privy
would
Vent.
be where I guess the smell of their number twos
Yeah.
went out off premises.
Yeah, it was like basically like having a, you know, vent fan like in your bathroom,
You think that
but way back in the day.
Thomas Jefferson ever took his book out and sat by the Privy Vent to be reminded that his shit does in fact stink?
He might have, but I mean, he wasn't sitting next to somebody when he was doing it, like
No.
Washington.
Nope, he didn't have the tandem double occupancy outhouse like Washington had.
Nope.
Guess Jefferson's enough of a hoity-toity guy that he wants a single-use outhouse.
That's it.
He doesn't want to share.
No. He's probably supplied a lot of people with trowels.
Yep.
But yeah, that was one hell of a trip. Monticello was fantastic.
Yeah.
And
Just
just
really nice.
really, really cool place to visit, and just the little bits and bobs that Lewis and Clark gave him that were hanging around were awesome to see, and just different invention type things that he did to make things easier for himself and to accurately keep track of pretty much exactly what the hell was going on with everything. You know, pretty wild. In summation, this guy was one hell of an intellect. If we ever did a top 5 on presidential intellects, Jefferson would be a hot contender.
He's going to be up there
for that list. You know, definitely had his faults.
Yep.
You know, I'm not going to say I love the guy, but not a shabby president.
I mean, nope. I mean, he was pretty successful for what he was trying to do. The one major issue that was shelved was obviously not dealt with, but he was very successful in getting rid of federalism and making the federal government into something that he was more comfortable with.
Yep, and a lot of people still cite Jefferson.
Mm-hmm.
He is a beacon of the type of democracy that we enjoy here in America.
Yeah, if you want to check out more about Thomas Jefferson, there are lots of great books by him. Can recommend the John Meacham authored biography of him is very good. Have the
what is it? Peterson?
Merrill Peterson has a very
that's
long
that's
and
a
detailed
really good
one.
like single volume, like super scholarly.
Yeah, it's very
biography.
detailed.
And then if you want to go full on Jefferson hardcore, Dumas Malone did like that 6-volume thing that is like the definitive life of Jefferson.
Yeah.
If you're into like 8,000 pages on Thomas Jefferson.
Also the Pulitzer Prize winning Hemings Is of Monticello that tells the other side of Jefferson's
definitely recommend that
family life.
Absolutely. And so, how best to sum up Thomas Jefferson as a person? Why don't we look to some of his contemporaries, see what they had to say.
Federalist Senator Timothy Pickering of Massachusetts, not a big fan of Thomas Jefferson during his presidency, said this: "The coward wretch at the head, while like a Parisian revolutionary monster prating about humanity, could feel an infernal pleasure in the utter destruction of his opponents. We have too long witnessed his general turpitude, his cruel removals of faithful officers, and the substitution of corruption and baseness for integrity and worth."
Ouch. Some scathing words.
Pickering was not a fan.
Not a fan, but one fella that was, and spoiler alert, he's the subject of our next episode, James Madison, said in 1826, "He lives and will live in the memory and gratitude of the wise and good, as a luminary of science, as a votary of liberty, as a model of patriotism, and as a benefactor of humankind."
That's James Madison.
On Thomas Jefferson, who has been the subject of this, the 3rd episode of the Dead Presidents podcast.
You can follow us on Twitter at Dead Prez Podcast. That's Prez with a Z. That is also our Instagram name. We are on all of your favorite podcast hosting sources. Like the podcast, subscribe, rate and review. Leave us a review and a rating if you think the podcast was great. And if you didn't like the podcast, you can get bent.
That's right.
That's been our show. Tune in next time to the Dead Presidents Podcast.
We're going to close with another little song by that, at this point, dare I say classic, outfit, the Constitutionalists. Here is Thomas Jefferson. Thanks again, and bye.
But man fears no truth, has nothing to fear from a lie. The bulk of mankind are schoolboys through life. Timid men prefer the calm of despotism to the boisterous sea of liberty. Of all the cankers of human happiness, none corrodes it with so silent yet so baneful a tooth as indolence. Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. Life is the art